Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 14 running back rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 14. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 36 running back rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings. Now, before we get into all the running back content, a couple reminders. If you're looking for a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, if you've yet to do so already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We are very close to achieving our goal of 82,000 subscribers. Thank you very much for all the support. Now, before we get into talking about matchups, I also want to go ahead and bring up a couple names in regards to waiver wire targets I want to add to yesterday's video based on the events that took place last night in the Monday Night Football game between the Cincinnati Bengals and Jacksonville Jaguars. Beginning with the Cincinnati Bengals, of course, we kind of have an indication as to who the primary handcuff is to Joe Mixon. Therefore, be sure to pick up Chase Brown in order to handcuff Joe Mixon going forward. Now, keeping on the topic of the Cincinnati Bengals, Jake Browning played incredibly well. 32 of 37 passing, looked like Joe Burrow out there, obviously led the team to a victory. If, in fact, you have him available in your league and you're in a situation where, of course, the available quarterbacks that we mentioned on yesterday's episode, like Gardner Minshew, Joe Flacco, Jameis Winston, are not available, Jake Browning, a fantastic option. I'd rather have Jake Browning than Joe Flacco and Jameis Winston going forward for the remainder of the season. Now, in regards to the other side of the ball, of course, when we talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars, Zay Jones immediately jumps to the top of this wide receiver conversation, primarily because Christian Kirk is going to require surgery due to the injury he sustained yesterday. And going forward, if in fact Trevor Lawrence is going to stay healthy, Zay Jones will absolutely be a big part of that offense like he was last season. So those are the couple names that I wanted to mention in regards to waiver wire pickups going forward. Now that that's all covered, let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about some running back matchups for Week 14. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have running back rushing statistics allowed. Thus far this season, from weeks 5 through 13, I've isolated running back rushing statistics in order to give you guys an indication as to the most advantageous matchups, regardless of what scoring format you play in, standard, half PPR, and of course, full PPR, because this is just rushing statistics, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns. The Arizona Cardinals, Indianapolis Colts, Carolina Panthers, the most advantageous matchups going into the given week, so on and so forth. Now, of course, we know that the Arizona Cardinals and Washington Commanders are on bye week, so we won't be able to take advantage of those matchups, but of course, guys like Joe Mixon taking on the Indianapolis Colts, or of course, Alvin Kamara taking on the Carolina Panthers. Taysom Hill should have himself a great week as well. Those are advantageous matchups to say the very least. Now, when we talk about some of the more disadvantageous matchups, one we might want to be a little bit careful with, the Chicago Bears. A couple weeks back, we saw David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs both dominate within that matchup, so we're not too worried about that overall scenario. The Atlanta Falcons are another one of these more difficult matchups. They haven't allowed a rushing touchdown to a running back all season long. Luckily for us, Rachaad White gets himself a lot of utilization through the air and absolutely can be fantasy relevant in that aspect of his overall game. I just wanted to go ahead and present these statistics. I'll refer back to them over the course of today's episode. Let's now go ahead and transition into talking about my top 36 running back rankings. Keep in mind before we get into it, rankings are always subject to change. Between now and Sunday morning's live stream, 7 to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, where I'll have updated rankings on screen, these rankings are going to change. There's going to be injury information that is revealed to us, guys like Kenneth Walker, Aaron Jones, DeAndre Swift, players that we're not 100% certain on, that may give us more of an indication as to whether or not they're going to play, how limited they'll be, all that kind of jazz. So for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description, and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, you'll get my rankings sent to you from my email directly to yours for the remainder of the season every single Sunday morning. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, includes flex rankings at a top 100, top 120 capacity. So if you guys are interested in taking advantage of the opportunity, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. Of course, I'll also be sending those rankings on Saturday of week 15 and 16, because if I'm not mistaken, there are 3 Saturday games in week 15 and 2 Saturday games in week 16. So keep an eye out for that. Of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. And if you sign up before Thursday night's game between the New England Patriots and Pittsburgh Steelers, you can take advantage of 0.5 total yards from Najee Harris in regards to a pick'em. So thank you very much. Okay, let's talk about the running back position, beginning with our number 1, Christian McCaffrey. He takes on the Seattle Seahawks. A top 5 matchup, to say the very least, on top of the fact that just a couple weeks ago, on Thanksgiving Day, they took on the Seattle Seahawks. In that matchup, Christian McCaffrey, 19 carries for 114 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 6 targets, 5 catches, 25 receiving yards, 28.4 fantasy points the last time he took on the Seattle Seahawks defense. My expectation is another big performance. This is a running back that has scored 31 total touchdowns in the last 26 games he has played with the San Francisco 49ers. The streak continues of scoring touchdowns every single week, coming off a performance of another 20-plus point game in a half PPR scoring format. Of course, an automatic start in a great matchup. Our number 2 to close out the S tier is Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara put together an unbelievable performance, 25.9 half PPR fantasy points. Not only was he able to get it done on the ground, 14 carries for 51 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. On top of it, there was another rushing attempt in the game in which he got tackled down at the 1 yard line. Later in that drive, somebody else scored a touchdown. Every running back is going to deal with that, but of course, Alvin Kamara had an opportunity of scoring 3 touchdowns. On top of the fact that he had 8 targets, 6 catches, 58 receiving yards on 58% of the offensive snaps. A lot of touches, 20 total within that overall span of time. Fantastic. Going into this week, they take on the Carolina Panthers. Of course, we know that they're one of the more advantageous matchups, allowing over 18 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. That does not involve the potential receiving upside that Alvin Kamara has every single week. They're allowing 4.36 yards per carry, and as long as Alvin Kamara and Taysom Hill continue to be the primary options within this offense, and there isn't any other running backs like a Jamal Williams vying for overall opportunities, Alvin Kamara is going to continue to be a dominant force. He's had 7 consecutive games of 4+ receptions. I don't even care that Jameis Winston is going to be the starting quarterback. I think that only helps in this overall scenario going forward as they lean upon the running game. Moving on to our number 3, we have Achane. I mentioned it on Sunday. Listen, I was worried that Achane wouldn't get himself a lot of utilization. And then at the end of the stream, I was mentioning to you guys, there's a potential in which in any given week, this guy could score 35 fantasy points. Now, in the first half of that game last week against the Washington Commanders, extremely quiet. 3 rushing attempts for 1 rushing yard, 2 receptions on 2 targets, 9 receiving yards. Had 2 fantasy points in the first half of that game, but the first half ended 31-7 in the favor of the Miami Dolphins. So what were they going to do in the second half? Of course, run the ball. They came out with Achane in the second half. 14 rushing attempts for 72 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 1 reception for 21 receiving yards, 21.8 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format in just the second half alone from Achane. While, of course, Raheem Mostert in the second half of that game, only 2 rushing attempts. They didn't really need to get him utilized because the game was over. They were running out the clock, and he was dominating. Now that we've seen Achane at a full healthy capacity, they're going to continue to utilize him going up against the Tennessee Titans this week. I expect them to take an early lead and, of course, dominate in the running game with Achane. Our number 4 this week is Josh Jacobs. Coming off the bye week, should be fully healthy, and he needs to be, especially considering the workload of opportunity that the Raiders have been giving him since Antonio Pierce has taken over as the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders. Of course, we have heard from Antonio Pierce in a press conference, him say that we feel comfortable when we give Josh Jacobs 20+ touches every single week. That's where we want to be. And over the course of the last 4 games with Antonio Pierce as their head coach, that's exactly what they have done. In 3 of those 4 games, he has had 26, 29, 24 touches. Throughout those 3 games, averaging 18 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Going up against the Minnesota Vikings, I'm expecting a high workload of opportunity and, of course, a lot of success from Josh Jacobs. Our number 5 is Bijan Robinson going into this week, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. A couple weeks back in week 7, it was the migraine week for Bijan Robinson. He did not participate in that matchup outside of 1 rushing attempt for 3 yards. Now, Tyler Algier and Cordero Patterson, of course, they had themselves a lot of opportunities. The entire backfield of the Atlanta Falcons combined for 32 rushing attempts, 118 rushing yards, 3 receptions, and 53 receiving yards, 18.6 fantasy points. We have seen that Bijan Robinson over the last 3 games has 63 total touches on the ground through the air combined. As long as they continue to give him workload at this opportunity level, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers shouldn't be a difficult task, especially considering the 2 interior inside linebackers, of course, White and David, are both injured for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I mean, we just saw Chuba Hubbard go for 25 carries, 104 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. Why not Bijan Robinson this week? Our number 6 is Kyren Williams, who's been playing incredibly well all season, and of course puts together another incredible game of 18.1 fantasy points, found the end zone once again. He's averaging a touchdown per game thus far this season and is not slowing down. And on top of it, played 94% of the offensive snaps on Sunday against the Cleveland Browns. Obviously, we had heard, Sean McVay say, we don't want to get him to that overall number. But hey, when you're the best running back in this offense and you have to continue to be on the field in order to help this team win, getting himself 24 total touches this last week, the more opportunity in terms of snaps is only going to lead to more upside in terms of fantasy purposes. So thus far this season, he's played 5 games of 80+% of the offensive snaps. In 6 games this season, he is ranked as a top 9 running back by the end of the week in terms of a half PPR ranking at the running back position. Of course, he continues to play well. I understand it's a difficult matchup taking on the Baltimore Ravens, a defense that since week 5 have been allowing 4.44 yards per carry. If in fact this offense can move the ball, if Puka Nacua is going to be healthy, and they can at least move the ball through the air, there is going to be an opportunity for Kyren Williams to put together another great performance here. Our number 7 is Rachaad White. Rachaad White has been playing incredibly well. I want to go ahead and just put this in perspective. Of course, he's coming off a performance of 18.1 in fantasy points, but if you compare weeks 1 through 6 compared to weeks 7 through 13, we have seen an explosion of opportunity and, of course, production out of Rachaad White. From weeks 1 through 6, he was averaging 9.0 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. From weeks 7 through 13, as of late, averaging 16.41 fantasy points per game. Obviously, he's been able to flourish in all aspects of his game: rushing, receiving, and of course, goal line utilization, finding the end zone on multiple occasions. This week, they take on the Atlanta Falcons. Last time out against the Falcons, week 7, 13 carries for 34 yards. Obviously, didn't get much done through the groundwork, but through the air, 6 targets, 6 catches, 65 receiving yards, still ended up with 12.9 fantasy points. I understand that this is the second most difficult matchup at the running back position, but I do anticipate Rachaad White to find himself another successful performance here. Our number 8 for this week is Zack Moss. Now, I understand that many of you are disappointed with the overall performance that Zack Moss put forth last week in an advantageous matchup against the Tennessee Titans, but take into account 19 rushing attempts, 2 receptions, 21 total touches. That is a ridiculously high number. I really can't complain with the volume of opportunity he was given, especially when you take into account in the last 4 games without Jonathan Taylor, he's had 22, 32, 18, and 21 touches. Workhorse level opportunity going in his direction on a winning team. So eventually it's going to get right. And this is the week for it to, of course, take place, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. Cincinnati Bengals are the 10th best matchup at the running back position, allowing 14.51 fantasy points per game, 4.39 yards per carry to opposing running backs over the course of weeks 5 through 13. Now, for those of you who didn't watch the game, there was an instance in which Zack Moss was tackled down at the 1-yard line, and then 2 plays later, the team kicks a field goal because on the following play, of course, Gardner Minshew gets sacked. The following play after that, they kick a field goal with Matt Gay. There were opportunities for him on the goal line. Unfortunately, they just didn't give it to him. Going into future weeks, I expect them to hand the ball off to, of course, Zack Moss. He'll find himself a lot of utilization on the ground through the air and, of course, be fantasy relevant against the Cincinnati Bengals. Moving on to our number 9, we have Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard has played extremely well. 3 consecutive game streak of scoring a rushing touchdown. Like I've talked about in the past, touchdowns cure everything for fantasy football. As long as your prospect is scoring touchdowns, you really can't complain because that 6-point influx is absolutely going to carry them on a weekly basis. Now, this week they do take on the Philadelphia Eagles. It is not an advantageous matchup. The last time out, Tony Pollard against the Philadelphia Eagles in week 9, of course, 12 carries for 51 rushing yards, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 12 receiving yards, only 7.8 fantasy points. If he scores a touchdown, he's fantasy relevant, and that's what I'm anticipating to see this week in the matchup. In the last 3 games, again, like I've mentioned, besides the 3 consecutive game streak of scoring a touchdown, he's been the number 6 overall running back in fantasy football half PPR in terms of fantasy points per game. I'm expecting another big performance here out of Tony Pollard. Our number 10 is Isiah Pacheco, who's coming off of consecutive great performances. Now, even though Jerick McKinnon has been absent and the receiving utilization has been great, getting himself 3+ receptions in each of the last 2 games, what he's been able to accomplish on the ground is what is most important. 3 rushing touchdowns in the last 2 games. Has an opportunity of taking on the Buffalo Bills, who have struggled in terms of stopping the run all season long. When we look at Isiah Pacheco and the potential of him getting himself 17+ touches in 8 of the last 12 games, and most recently coming off a performance of 21 total touches, with Patrick Mahomes in the passing game struggling as of late, considering, of course, the receiving core that surrounds him isn't up to the level at which they need to be, there's going to be more of an emphasis of using Isiah Pacheco going forward. I'm anticipating him to have another incredible performance here as he continues to run hard and make a lot of plays on the ground. My number 11 for this week is Joe Mixon. In no circumstance did I ever believe that Joe Burrow was going to suit up last night, because that's what I saw. Jake Browning looked like Joe Burrow. 32 of 37 passing. An unbelievable performance overall. I mean, just the overall game script in which they executed. I mean, they were unstoppable. As an offense on the ground through the air, the Jacksonville Jaguars had no answers, outside of course, Tyler Boyd throwing that interception. I mean, Joe Mixon, 19 carries, 68 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 7 targets, 6 catches, 49 receiving yards, played 71% of the offensive snaps, even with Chase Brown, the backup running back, coming in and getting 9 rushing attempts throughout that overall game. It didn't matter. Joe Mixon, a dominant force within this backfield, and going forward, even with Chase Brown only playing, 15% of the offensive snaps, we'll take that. We need to give Joe Mixon breaks. If this opportunity is going to continue to stay within this overall realm, 25 total touches, a huge workload of opportunity within the receiving game. He's going to be the goal line back. If this offense can continue to be efficient, taking on the Indianapolis Colts, the second best matchup at the position, if this offense continues to play as well as they did last night, I don't see a reality in which they're not able to put up a great performance against a defense that gives up 18 plus fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics isolated since week 5. Our number 12 for this week is David Montgomery, and I also wanted to bring up our number 13, Jahmyr Gibbs. We want to talk about them both because, again, both these running backs are very much so implicated with one another. Now, in this last week's game against the New Orleans Saints, this is the first time since David Montgomery has returned from his injury in which he has outsnapped Jahmyr Gibbs. Typically, it has been like a 70-30 split in which David Montgomery barely sees the field, plays about 25 to 30% of the overall offensive snaps, but against the New Orleans Saints, played 62% of the offensive snaps. Obviously, they were up early, and they wanted to run the ball in order to kill the clock. Nonetheless, what David Montgomery provides, and the reason why he's my number 12 and ahead of Jahmyr Gibbs, is rushing touchdown upside. He has scored a rushing touchdown in every single healthy games he has played this season. He is on a streak, and he's not slowing down anytime soon. This offense has played extremely well, and this week he has an opportunity of taking on his former team once again. Last time out, against the Chicago Bears, 12 carries for 76 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown, 16.8 fantasy points overall. Had himself a couple sprinkles of receiving work. If he's going to put up another great performance against his former team, of course, he deserves to be a top 12 running back. Now, in regards to Jahmyr Gibbs, like we mentioned, of course, the fewest amount of overall snaps that he has played since, of course, David Montgomery has returned since week 10. Now, when we look at weeks 10 through 12, the overall touches that Jahmyr Gibbs was getting, 17, 14, 15. Incredible. This last week only had 9 total touches, a huge, downtick there. And obviously, it was apparent 5.9 half PPR fantasy points is not going to cut it in a lot of scenarios. So we're going to have to hope that he gets more utilization, more opportunity, similar to the last time he took on the Chicago Bears. In that game, 8 carries for 36 and a rushing touchdown, 6 catches on 6 targets, 59 and 18.5 fantasy points. Outproduced David Montgomery. But again, in any given week, Jahmyr Gibbs, considering he is the RB2 of this team, could end up getting himself a downtick of opportunity. A lot of the receiving utilization that he's got over the course of the last month certainly has helped him. Of course, against the New Orleans Saints, that wasn't present. Therefore, his overall performance was a little bit lackluster in comparison to his norm. Moving on to our number 14, we have Saquon Barkley coming off of the bye week. Saquon Barkley, in the last 5 games he has played with Tommy DeVito, 14.3 fantasy points, 12.8, 6.6, 28.0, and 5.7. So outside of the one performance of 28 fantasy points in which he scored 2 touchdowns, and both of them were receiving touchdowns at that, he has yet to score a touchdown over the course of the last 5 games with Tommy DeVito as the quarterback of this team. And we have already, heard that even with Tyrod Taylor returning from the injured reserve, Tommy DeVito is going to be the starting quarterback going forward. They do take on the Green Bay Packers. It is an advantageous matchup, primarily because on the ground, they've given up a bunch of statistics to opposing running backs. Over the course of the last 4 games, these are some of the numbers that they've allowed. To Kansas City running backs, 20 carries for 116 and a touchdown. To Detroit Lions running backs, 26 for 125 and a touchdown. To Pittsburgh running backs, 31 for 183 and 2 touchdowns. Incredible performances across the board for running backs against this defense. So why not Saquon Barkley? Coming off the bye week, should see himself another game in which he gets 20 total touches. We just have to hope he falls into the end zone in order to reach his top 12 upside. Moving on to our number 15, we have Derrick Henry, who's played extremely well as of late. Now, we heard yesterday from Mike Vrabel, he should be good to go. He is not going to be in the concussion protocol. He was tested late Sunday and, of course, was tested Monday morning. As long as there's no setbacks, fantastic, we should be good to go. Derrick Henry should be the starting running back. But my issue is that they take on the Miami Dolphins. It's not that it's a difficult matchup. The problem is the Miami Dolphins don't really have teams running against them much because they're taking such a commanding lead early in the game. Just like against the Washington Commanders on Sunday, they were up 31-7 at halftime. If something like that takes place once again this week against the Tennessee Titans, of course, Derrick Henry's not going to have a lot of opportunity to run the ball 20 plus times in the second half. Luckily for us, Derrick Henry in the last 2 games has scored 4 rushing touchdowns, 2 in each of the last 2 games, which certainly makes a huge difference, especially in comparison to just a month ago where he had back-to-back games of less than 6 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. We just have to hope that we avoid that Derrick Henry can run the ball early, find himself a lot of success, and in doing so, he can at least fend off this Dolphins offense from taking a huge lead and forcing, of course, Will Levis from passing the ball for majority of Sunday's game. That's the only concern that we have going into this week. Is it a Sunday game? Maybe it's a Monday game. I just looked it up. It is in fact a Monday game, and so do the Giants and Green Bay Packers. They also play on Monday. 2 Monday games. Very interesting. Our number 16 for this week is Travis Etienne. We don't know 100% whether or not Trevor Lawrence is going to be active. If Trevor Lawrence is not active, of course, I do anticipate Travis Etienne to be in this mid-range RB2 kind of position, primarily because the offense just won't be as efficient with CJ Beathard under center. That being said, there is always the potential in which, Travis Etienne going up against the Cleveland Browns, the 8th best matchup at the position since week 5, a defense that is allowing nearly 15 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics isolated, and 4.66 yards per carry to opposing running backs. So luckily last night, Travis Etienne was able to get past his drought of, not scoring a touchdown for 3 consecutive games, found the end zone early, fantastic. But unfortunately, Trevor Lawrence, a 3rd consecutive game in which he has scored a rushing touchdown, stealing a lot of value from Travis Etienne. If in fact Trevor Lawrence is not able to go, the value of Travis Etienne lowers. If T-Law does in fact play with the high ankle sprain, there'll be less opportunity for him to run the ball and steal value from Travis Etienne, which in my mind would make him a higher ranked player going into the given week in an advantageous matchup. My number 17 for this week is Austin Ekeler. He's coming off a dreadful performance of 14 carries for 18 yards, 2 catches for 9 yards, 3.7 fantasy points. Extremely underwhelming as of late. Over the course of weeks 11 through 13, he has had 34 rushing attempts for 114 rushing yards, 3.35 yards per carry on average. He's had only 12 targets in the last 3 games, only 9 receptions, on only 47 receiving yards. He has only scored 16.6 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He has a career low of a 3.54 yard per carry average and a 2.63 yards after contact per attempt average. I understand that the matchup against the Denver Broncos is, in the top 12 at the position. They're allowing 5.39 yards per carry to opposing running backs, nearly 14 fantasy points per game. I understand that. It's a division rival matchup. Austin Ekeler should be playing far better than he has, but maybe age has purely caught up with him, and the offensive line certainly isn't doing any favors in his overall direction. Moving on to our number 18, we have James Cook. James Cook in the last 2 games with the new offensive coordinator, of course, Joe Barry taking over, he is averaging 15.35 fantasy points per game. He's been able to get himself 17 and 16 rushing attempts, which of course are incredible numbers. He's also been able to accumulate 11 total targets in the last 2 games for 9 receptions, 21 touches per game. What more can you ask for, especially going up against the Kansas City Chiefs? In order to beat the Kansas City Chiefs, you have to ensure that you play great defense, and you have to efficiently run the ball in order to keep the ball out of the Kansas City offense's hands. Therefore, I do anticipate a lot of utilization in the running game from James Cook. Of course, there are going to be sprinkles of Ty Johnson and Latavius Murray, but James Cook has played extremely well this season, and when he's getting such a high volume of opportunity and how efficient he has played this season, there's always the potential he could also score a touchdown on the ground through the air. He's a fantastic play at a top 18 capacity. Our number 19 is Gus Edwards. I understand that he's coming off a bye week, but let's not forget what he was capable of accomplishing from week 7 through 11. Throughout that span of time, was averaging 19.16 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. He had scored 9 rushing touchdowns in 5 games. I understand the last time we saw him against the Los Angeles Chargers, he only had 8 attempts for 26 rushing yards, didn't find the end zone, but take into account that this is a running back that is still going to get himself a lot of opportunity. Now, I understand that he was outsnapped by Keaton Mitchell last time out against the Los Angeles Chargers, but I truly do believe that going forward, this is going to be a kind of split backfield between Gus Edwards, a couple sprinkles of Justice Hill, and of course, a lot of utilization from Keaton Mitchell. As long as Gus Edwards is still the primary preferred back in terms of the goal line utilization, he is still going to have upside value as an RB2. Assuming he finds the end zone just once, could very easily have himself 12 plus fantasy points with no receiving utilization at all, based on, just 6 points from a touchdown, 60 yards, 6 points there. I don't see that being out of the realm of possibility this week. My number 20 for this week is DeAndre Swift. He's coming off a week in which he had 6 total rushing attempts for 13 rushing yards. When you're dealing with an injury, of course, you're going to get yourself a lack of overall touches, on top of the fact that the game script from the game against the San Francisco 49ers really didn't imply that they needed to run the ball even more in the second half. They needed to throw in order to get back into the game. And unfortunately, it just didn't go in the direction of DeAndre Swift. Obviously left that game early. If in fact he's going to be healthy and active this week, I think we'll still see far more Kenneth Gainwell than we feel comfortable with, and we'll probably not get as many overall touches in the direction of DeAndre Swift, especially considering last time out against the Dallas Cowboys, 18 carries for only 43 rushing yards, 2 receptions for 31 receiving yards, 8.4 fantasy points, very much so a below average performance from DeAndre Swift. Hopefully, he'll be healthy this week. If not, I'd rather them just hold him out and get him ready for the fantasy playoffs weeks 15 through 17 at a healthy capacity, considering how great those overall matchups are going forward. On number 21 is Najee Harris. Last week on 4th down, they had an opportunity on the goal line. Unfortunately, 0 yards gained, didn't end up scoring a touchdown. They gave him opportunities on the goal line. He's going to continue to be the goal line opportunity back for this team. Of course, they're going to give a couple, shares here and there to Jaylen Warren over the course of the rest of the season. But in the absence of Kenny Pickett, this is an offense that is going to have to lean upon the running game, and specifically Najee Harris. He's had himself 15 touches in 4 of the last 5 games he has played, and of course has been able to accompany some of those performances with rushing touchdowns. Unfortunately, on Sunday against the Arizona Cardinals, an advantageous matchup, just wasn't able to find the end zone. But if in fact he did, we would have no complaints and we'd be firing him up at a maximum capacity, especially considering they take on the New England Patriots on Thursday. With Mitchell Trubisky, like I mentioned, they're of course going to lean upon the running game. Last season, 2022, there was a game in which Mitchell Trubisky started and they took on the New England Patriots. Najee Harris in that game, 15 carries for 49 rushing yards, 5 catches, 40 receiving yards, 11.4 fantasy points. There is a potential in which the New England Patriots can play well against a bad quarterback and can force him to make mistakes. But as long as this team plays conservatively, doesn't force any mistakes, and of course allows Najee Harris to carry them to the promised land, they will find success on Thursday night. Moving on to our number 22, we have Raheem Mostert. We all knew that this moment would come, that Achane would eventually take over, especially in second half of games. In the first half of this game, Raheem Mostert had 10 of his 12 overall touches. In the second half, only 2 touches completely disappeared. Luckily, he was able to score a touchdown at the very end of the first half, scored 11.6 fantasy points as a total. If in fact there's going to be a situation which this continues to be the case, if not, Achane gets himself more utilization in the first half of games, Raheem Mostert is slowly going to disappear and be this RB2 candidate for the remainder of the season, who is always going to have rushing touchdown upside, but it's just not going to be at a higher capacity as it typically was in the absence of Achane. Taking on the Titans this week, again, an advantageous matchup, but he needs opportunity to lead to success. Moving on to our number 23, we have Chuba Hubbard. Speaking of opportunity leading to success, Chuba Hubbard has been unbelievable in the last 2 games. 3 rushing touchdowns. In comparison to the 10 prior games, only had 1 total touchdown. As of late, of course, with the new coaching regime that has taken over, of course, they got rid of the head coach, the quarterback coach, and the running back coach. They are leaning more in the direction of Chuba Hubbard rather than Miles Sanders. Chuba Hubbard, 25 total rushing attempts for 104 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They take on the New Orleans Saints, the 7th best matchup at the position, allowing over 15 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated, 4.5 yards per carry. Chuba Hubbard, a solid RB2 option this week. Moving on to our number 24, we have Javonte Williams. The issue that I have with Javonte Williams is that he doesn't score rushing touchdowns. At the running back position, like I mentioned with Tony Pollard, touchdowns cure everything. And the issue is there's such a rotation within this backfield. One week it's Javonte Williams, one week it's Samaje Perine, the other week it's Jaleel McLaughlin. Anyone can score a touchdown. We already know that Cortland Sutton every single week is guaranteed a touchdown within this offense. But if in fact we cannot get Javonte Williams finding the end zone, especially up against the Los Angeles Chargers defense, he does get his opportunities. And he is going to get himself probably 16 to 20 touches every single week. But without getting that 6-point influx, truly is a low-end RB2, high-end RB3. Moving on to our number 25, we have Kenneth Walker. Like I mentioned earlier, we're not 100% certain as to whether or not he's going to be healthy, whether Zach Charbonnet is going to be healthy. But there was a couple comments from Pete Carroll that does give us a little bit of potential, which maybe Kenneth Walker can be available against the San Francisco 49ers. If in fact we can get a couple limited practices over the course of this week, maybe a full practice by Friday, that'll give us enough confidence in which we can fire up Kenneth Walker within the matchup. Outside of that, make sure to go ahead. If you don't have Zach Charbonnet already as a handcuff option, make sure you look in the direction of DJ Dallas in terms of a player that you can pick up after waiver wire runs later tonight going into the week against the San Francisco 49ers for those of you in desperate need of a running back play. My number 26 for this week is A.J. Dillon. Earlier today, the Green Bay Packers signed Kenyon Drake to their practice squad. It doesn't bode well for the potential of Aaron Jones going forward dealing with an MCL sprain. My expectation, Aaron Jones is not going to return. In his absence, A.J. Dillon should continue to get himself a good workload of opportunity. 19 total touches against the Kansas City Chiefs, a total of 18 carries for 73 rushing yards. There are a couple stats that I wanted to mention in regards to A.J. Dillon. Besides the fact that he takes on the Giants, the 4th best matchup, nearly 17 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated, 4.8 yards per carry allowed to opposing running backs since week 5. I mean, ridiculous numbers there. Matt LaFleur, the head coach of the Green Bay Packers, is 16-0 as the head coach of the Green Bay Packers in the month of December. In the last 4 December games that A.J. Dillon has played in his career, he's averaging 15.25 fantasy points per game and nearly 17 touches per game. Again, the opportunity is going to be there. Hopefully he files into the end zone for us. Moving on to number 27, we have Ezekiel Elliott. Of course, in the absence of Ramondre Stevenson, Zeke is probably going to get himself 20 plus touches. That seems like it's probably kind of baked into his overall workload of opportunity, primarily because who else are they going to give the ball to out of this backfield? Is Bailey Zappi really going to be able to carry this offense against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense on Thursday on a short week? I don't anticipate that being the case. I expect Zeke Very similar to, of course, Sunday's performance, 17 carries, 52 rushing yards, 4 catches for 40 receiving yards. If he's able to get himself another 20 plus touches, I think 10 fantasy points is a guarantee for him going into the given matchup. I understand that most recently, James Conner had a huge revenge game against that defense, 105 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. It's definitely not impossible to find success in terms of running the ball against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Moving on to 128, we have Jaylen Warren. Jaylen Warren, of course, had 9 carries for 59 rushing yards, still highly efficient in his overall opportunities, but when you're only getting 10 touches within a given week, it doesn't accompany a lot of receiving utilization, doesn't find himself in the end zone. He's not really as much of a trusted prospect. In the absence of Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky should be able to keep this offense afloat. But again, it's just going to be a matter of how efficient they're going to be as an offense. The Patriots have played well against bad teams. And I think the Pittsburgh Steelers, with Mitch Trubisky as their quarterback, as an offense, are a bad team. I do believe this Thursday night football game is going to be an under in terms of its overall total. And I think Jaylen Warren is going to be limited in his overall touches, which should lead to less overall fantasy production. Moving on to our number 29. Speaking of low fantasy production, we have Breece Hall. It is unfortunate where Breece Hall has pretty much ended up as of late. Since week 6, he's averaging 28 rushing yards per game. He has had himself in his individual games 39, 17, 50, 28, 23, 25, 16 rushing yards this last week against the Houston Texans on 13 total carries. Those are Austin Ekeler numbers. Luckily, at least Breece Hall gets himself receiving utilization in comparison to Austin Ekeler, who, yes, I have ranked significantly higher. But considering this offense, I mean, now that they've just gone ahead and released Tim Boyle, I don't even know who's going to be starting as their quarterback. Luckily, Breece Hall has had himself 5 receptions per game over the course of the last 6 weeks. Fantastic. We'll take it. But the fact that he takes on the Houston Texans, who are allowing just 3.06 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs since week 5, unless he finds himself in the end zone with his receiving utilization, the upside is really not implicated within his overall potential performance here. Moving on to our number 30, we have Keaton Mitchell. Like I mentioned earlier, in week 12, prior to the bye week, he had a season high 46% of the offensive snaps. He's beginning to get himself far more utilization. He had a season high 11 total touches. And he led the backfield in total touches. If that's going to continue to be the case, we know that he's a very dynamic player, and with one singular rushing attempt reception, can very easily find himself in the end zone. He lines up in the slot, he lines up out wide, he lines up in the backfield. They're going to give him opportunity to stay on the field and, of course, be a huge contributing option. Hopefully, can find himself a lot of success at home against the LA Rams this week. Moving on to our number 31, we have Dameon Pierce. It is evident based on the overall opportunity that they give Dameon Pierce on the ground, 15 carries for 41 rushing yards, and the goal line carry for 1 rushing touchdown. They did split the overall rushing attempts on the goal line, 3 in the direction of Dameon Pierce, 1 in the direction of Singletary on Sunday against the New York Jets, but of course the majority going in the direction of Dameon Pierce. It seems like they prefer him as the running back of this team. The receiving utilization will go in the direction of Singletary. He'll get himself a sprinkle of rushing work, but Dameon Pierce taking on the Jets, an advantageous matchup, should have himself another great overall performance here, assuming he can find the end zone. Outside of that, in terms of yardage alone, again, not the greatest overall play. Therefore, he's at number 31. Moving on to our number 32, Alexander Mattison. He's going to continue to split overall touches with Ty Chandler. As long as that is going to be the case and that overall threat of a presence of another running back within this backfield is going to be there, Alexander Mattison, lack of touchdowns has certainly been the overall topic of conversation for him. It hasn't really been a lack of touches, more that he just doesn't score any touchdowns. Even though he takes on the 6th best matchup at the position, taking on the Raiders, I don't really trust him going into this week. My number 33 this week is Jerome Ford. As long as the receiving utilization continues to stay present like it has all season long, he's going to be of value. 3 catches, 33 yards, and a receiving touchdown. Got lucky that he scored a touchdown. Otherwise, the performance on the ground, not great. 19 yards on 9 carries. Very similar to what Austin Ekeler and Breece Hall produced this week. But nonetheless, they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. They were the toughest matchup prior to last night's game at the running back position in terms of yardage on the ground. But somehow, someway, the Cincinnati Bengals torched them on the ground. If the Cleveland Browns can lock in on exactly what the Cincinnati Bengals were able to accomplish, and they can expose that once again, Jerome Ford, Kareem Hunt could be a value going into this week for sure. Moving on to our number 34, Tyjae Spears. Again, I do anticipate him to continue to get more touches if, in fact, this matchup gets out of hand. And, of course, Derrick Henry is not going to be on the field as often because, of course, this is going to be a passing offense for the majority of the second half of the game. Tyjae Spears, of course, has himself a lot of potential upside in that overall capacity. Our number 35 is Roschon Johnson. I have no clue whether or not Deontay Foreman is going to be healthy, but we know that the last time we saw the Chicago Bears play, there were 15 touches in the direction of Roschon Johnson, primarily 10 carries, 5 receptions. If they want to continue to utilize him as the primary receiving back of this offense, of course, could be a value taking on the Detroit Lions. The final player I wanted to mention, Kareem Hunt, had himself the majority of overall rushing attempts within this backfield. 12 carries for 48 rushing yards, was a fantastic option. Unfortunately, wasn't able to find the end zone. A couple of the other receiving threats caught themselves touchdowns within this given game. But if, in fact, Kareem Hunt can fall into the end zone in any given week, very easily jumps from number 36 into a top 24 running back capacity with that overall uptick of 6 fantasy points, like we talk about with Javonte Williams and all these other running backs that just don't find the end zone as often as they should. Okay, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with my top 40 wide receivers for week 14 of the 2023 fantasy football season. I appreciate all the support. If you guys haven't not yet already, click the like button down below, subscribe, help us get to our goal of 82,000 subscribers. Check out Underdog Fantasy, put together a couple pick'em slips, draft some teams, and of course, support the channel to get my rankings every single Sunday for the remainder of the season. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.